I wish to thank Councilmember Allen and the Council as a whole for holding these roundtables and the opportunity to discuss this very critical issue. I am Mara Verheyden-Hilliard. I am the Executive Director of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund and a constitutional rights litigator. The Partnership for Civil Justice Fund brought a series of lawsuits over the years exposing police misconduct in the District of Columbia, including mass arrests without particularized probable cause, improper use of police lines to kettle, trap, and detain people engaged in free speech activities, failure to provide dispersal orders and any opportunity to comply with orders, and indiscriminate use of force and brutality, excessive force, illegal MPD infiltration and provocateur operations within demonstrations. And we worked closely with this council, with the District of Columbia Council, when it held extensive investigations under the leadership of now Councilmember Che, and when it conducted hearings into the police misconduct that was so vast and so extreme in respect to First Amendment activities. And it resulted in the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act, a law that really stands apart and is so significant and has had such a major effect on demonstrations in Washington, D.C. The lawsuits that the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund brought vindicating the rights of people whose constitutional rights were deprived by the MPD resulted in damages of more than $25 million and additional equitable relief and changes in police practices and policies. And we've seen the changes in policing in Washington, D.C. in recent years. It has stood apart from many other major jurisdictions as a result of the FARPSA, of the settlements, of police training. We could see it with Black Lives Matter demonstrations where people were able to take to the streets to express themselves, to speak out against racist policing, and have strong and powerful demonstrations and not be met by the repression that we could see in other jurisdictions all over the United States. But now, with the nomination of Peter Newsham to become the permanent chief of police, it appears that all of that is turning backwards. This is a pivotal moment in American life. With the election of President Donald Trump, the nation is witnessing a groundswell of political activity in which people are taking to the streets, sidewalks, parks to engage in mass demonstrations, the likes of which are really unprecedented and certainly haven't been seen for decades. People are coming together to speak out in opposition to racist, misogynist, environmentally devastating policies and programs, and coming out to defend targeted communities. And as we know, Washington, D.C. is the most important jurisdiction in the United States for the expression of fundamental First Amendment rights and the epicenter of all mass mobilization for social change and civil rights. And the decision as to who will be the next chief of police must recognize that one of the most important responsibilities of that office will be the unequivocal, steadfast obedience to the Constitution and protection of free speech rights. And Peter Newsham has made clear, not only by words but by action, that he is unable or unwilling to carry out that function and obey without deviation the requirements of the Constitution and the requirements of this Council's First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act, which is not a matter of policy, it is a matter of law. Interim Chief Newsham's history conducting mass violations of constitutional rights of demonstrations is a matter of public record. My organization, the PCJF, brought class action litigation vindicating the rights of those 400 people who were mass arrested, resulting in damages of more than $8.5 million. And I note that those damages were not paid for by Peter Newsham, they're paid for by the District of Columbia. The highest court, federal court in Washington, D.C., the D.C. Circuit, called his response and his actions ludicrous, and yet he stated to the city paper just 1 month ago, "I stand by that decision." This is not a mistake, it was a decision. And it is not past history because as recently as 2 months ago, he appears to have acted in stark violation of those laws, conducting a mass dragnet arrest, devoid of particularized probable cause, and deployment of mass indiscriminate force and soaking use of chemical munitions. This Council cannot overlook these facts, and we have sought the documents that are required to be mandated, that are mandated to be created and made public under the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act and that are critical to this council's evaluation of what happened on January 20th. The MPD and Peter Newsham are refusing to release those documents. We have filed a lawsuit as of yesterday to seek those documents, and we are saying now that this council cannot hold a vote on Peter Newsham's nomination until those documents are released and until there is an investigation into what happened on January 20th.
And I want to turn to Ms. Verheyden-Hilliard. Thank you for your very strong testimony. And the question I wanted to ask you was actually, I'm going to ask kind of a devil's advocate question a little bit. And that is, you referenced, for example, obviously as the nation capital, we are, going to be the home of and the host to many, many protests, as we should be as the nation's capital. I've heard one question that's posed to me is when concerns have been highlighted around actions around either January 20th or with Pershing Park, has said, well, what about the vast number of protests that we've had that have been very successful, that have protected First Amendment rights, that aren't permitted, aren't planned, but we've seen streets shut down, we've seen officers just go and help make sure they guide and be there to help protect that right to protest and do it in the way that I think we would all have that same expectation. Can you, and I realize I'm already over time a little bit, but just briefly talk a little bit about what your perception is of how you draw a distinction between events that are not acceptable and not up to those standards that we uphold and those that do?
Well, your question itself is very important because, as you just said, this issue of having demonstrations where they were not, use the word, permitted. But I would note that under the law that this council passed, that we worked with this council to pass, the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act, there is no longer a permitting system in the District of Columbia. There is a notice and plan approval system. You may not be arrested for demonstrating without a permit. And that law and the lawsuits really changed the conduct of policing, which we could see. But for many people, and maybe people who weren't here before, it used to be, prior to that time, that coming out in the streets of Washington, D.C., you had a very significant risk of false arrest, a very significant risk of brutality, of excessive force, when you were doing nothing wrong. And now we are facing a time when there are growing protests, when people to be taking to the streets. The protests that have been handled properly, as you note, have been handled properly. And that's what we want to see. And that's a consequence of following the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act. But on the very first demonstration, mass demonstration, under Chief Newsham's leadership as interim chief, we saw a turnback and a direct violation of the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act, direct violations of the Constitution. And I want to note, it's very easy for people to just say, well, there was a riot, which I think is a mischaracterization in terms of the breadth of what happened. Because the police are authorized, and of course, to arrest someone that breaks the law. That's not what's at issue here. The issue is the police acting with precision. And there are Supreme Court cases after Supreme Court cases that talk about, particularly from the Civil Rights era and the Vietnam War era, the importance of acting with precision explicitly so that if somebody is in a crowd and breaks the law or commits an act of vandalism or damage, that in fact others are not subjected to arrest, to brutality, to force simply because of their proximity. And moreover, the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act, with that in mind, delineated very explicit rules about what the police are supposed to do in the context of First Amendment activity if there is a person or persons who break the law, how you deal with that person, how you have particularized probable cause, how you explicitly do not do what Peter Newsham did on January 20th, which is to conduct a mass dragnet arrest. He swept up people that were journalists. He swept up legal observers. He swept up people that were demonstrating that had not broken the law. Those people are being subject to prosecution of felony riot. I mean, the threat of significant fines, time in jail, it's upending their lives. That is not a risk that we can take in the District of Columbia. And can you imagine coming out to demonstrate in support of immigrant rights as an undocumented person, knowing that you face the risk that if someone in the crowd does something wrong, breaks a window, no one's saying, go ahead and break a window. We're saying, if you're in a crowd and you're demonstrating and you're chanting and you're carrying signs and someone else breaks the law, we now risk that Peter Newsham and the MPD under his command can sweep up anybody and subject them to the prosecution by the state. Okay. And that is not a risk that Washington, D.C. can take.
Evans, Ms. Verheyden-Hilliard, I spoke with Chief Newsham yesterday, actually, about the very quote that you mentioned about Pershing Park, and he's told me in no uncertain terms that he felt that he made some wrong decisions at Pershing Park. And he also told me regarding January 20th, because it seems like your concerns are centered around what happened at Pershing and then what happened in the inauguration, that he will thoroughly investigate any sort of police wrongdoing or diversions from police procedure and thoroughly investigate the actions that police took on the 20th. So given that, why is that not, or tell me why I should still have discomfort with Chief Newsham if he's, said that he has learned from the actions of Pershing. In fact, I think everyone at the witness table has talked about how MPD has improved and evolved its approach. The Chief and I talked about that yesterday. So tell me, why is this not satisfactory?
In fact, at no point has any public statement that that I have seen or anyone that I'm familiar with has seen from Peter Newsham unequivocally acknowledged that what he did was illegal and unconstitutional. I have seen statements where he says he stands by the decision. I've seen statements where he is saying that there, in the passive were mistakes made or that the MPD has learned. This is not a guessing game. It's not a guessing game on the ground and at the moment of the time. The Constitution lays out very clear parameters as to lawful police conduct and the handling of First Amendment activities, and this council went out of its way to delineate very specific laws under which the MPD operates. One need only read those provisions of the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act and see that those provisions were violated on January 20th. That law explicitly addresses how you deal with people who do break the law, who break a window. Whereas, again, no one is defending that conduct, but how you deal with them and not suppress and repress and violate the civil rights of all others who may be out simply because they share a political point of view at that moment in time. And it is not enough to say, well, we can just go forward with a hope and a guess and let the courts sort it out later, because, that's what Chief Ramsey said after the infamous Pershing Park arrest. We'll lock them all up now and we'll let the courts sort it out later. What has to happen now is an obedience to the Constitution at a time and place when we are the epicenter of First Amendment rights. And Peter Newsham, among all of the available candidates, is someone who is known for mass violation of civil rights at a scope of which should shock the conscience.
Let me ask you, is it Chief Newsham, or do these actions disqualify any internal candidate in your mind from the Metropolitan Police Force?
I'm not aware of another candidate who played a leadership role or a direct role in the demonstrations and the response to the demonstrations, particularly the illegal demonstrations. And again, I would note, and we have been saying publicly, up until January 20th, the DC MPD has really acted in response to demonstrations head and shoulders above so many other police departments around the country. And I think people have been really impressed to see the way that demonstrators could take to the streets, and the police were not coming up against them and acting as if what they were doing was criminalized activity.
So you would give Chief Newsham none of the credit for that? I mean, it seems like he should also deserve the credit for being able to handle the vast majority of demonstrations very peacefully.
That has not been under his leadership. As soon as he took leadership, which was just 6 months ago, this is the first mass demonstration under his leadership, and what we saw was a direct violation of the FARPSA and the Constitution. And again, the police are to act with precision. They did not.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you very much to this panel, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.